Of all the anxiety-producing moments in CRNA school, and there are many, one of the biggest is taking the C. Most students already have some test anxiety already. You're all so driven and type A. But the C seems to bring anxiety to a new level. On today's episode of Elevate, we're going to talk about the C, how it works, what the scores mean, and hopefully remove some of the fear surrounding it. I'm Joshua Olson, Assistant Professor and Assistant Program Director of Nurse Anesthesiology and co-founder of Elevate. Elevate exists for one reason, to help you succeed in CRNA school and help you pass the board exam on the first try. In the CRNA world, the C is the self-evaluation examination. Notice that the last E in C stands for examination, so you don't call it the C exam. It's not an examination exam, it's just called the C. It's like calling chai tea, right? You don't call it TT, it's just chai. Same thing, it's just the C. There are three purposes for the C. One is to help students determine how well they're doing in their knowledge of anesthesia. Two is to help the CRNA faculty at their program determine how well a student is doing. And the third is to get the student, or get you, ready to take the national certification exam, the board exam, the NCE. So think of this as a way to measure your anesthesia knowledge, as well as a slight predictor for success on the board exam. Notice what isn't listed here, a benchmark for continuing on in the CRNA program. I think the C is used this way, and there's a lot of really smart CRNA faculty out there who use the C as a gateway for students to progress in their programs. But the NBCRNA actually recommends against using that way. The test is 240 questions, and you get 4 hours to take it. Unlike the NCE, which we talk about in a different video, everyone gets the same amount of questions on the C. The test is adaptable, although the NBCRNA doesn't actually publish what their algorithm is for what the adaptability is. But in general, it means that if you get a question right, the next question is harder. If you get a question wrong, the next question is easier. They're trying to find a baseline of where you are in your knowledge, right? So if you get one right, it gets a little harder. If you get it wrong, it gets a little easier, and eventually they figure out where your baseline is of understanding. Everyone gets 240 questions, which is different than the NCE. That's an adaptable amount, but everybody gets 240. To register to take the exam, your program director actually has to authorize you to test. When they do that, you should get an email telling you that you can schedule your C. Pearson VUE is the vendor that NBCRNA uses, so you have to schedule through them. When you get to their website, they'll have an A to Z list for you to pick from. You pick the N on the list, that stands for NBCRNA, and then you should be able to pick the C. Also, it's good to know that's $280 every time you take it. So it's not cheap. It's kind of expensive. So maybe that's an incentive for you to do well the first time. If you have to take it multiple times to obtain a certain score, it can get expensive really quickly. Once you start the test, you have 4 hours to complete it. You can take breaks, however, but one caution with the breaks, the timer keeps running. Well, one exception to that. At the 2-hour mark, you get an optional 10-minute break, and the timer actually pauses during that 10 minutes. So if you want to take a break at the 2-hour mark, you get a free 10 minutes. Otherwise, you can take a break anytime, just the timer keeps running. And you can't bring any electronic devices in with you. That makes sense, right? They'll give you a locker to put your stuff in. So your things like your phone, your smartwatch. Actually, this is my favorite. They list this on their website. You can't bring your e-cigarettes in, right? So no vaping during the C. I actually love the idea of somebody sitting there vaping while they're taking the C. That would be amazing to see somebody sitting there taking it. But the NBCRNA and Pearson VUE disagree with me. So you can't take your e-cigarette in with you. They will give you noise-canceling headphones when you get in there, and you can't have anything to write on. You can't bring a paper or pencil, but they will give you a dry erase board and a dry erase marker so you can write with. You can only take one question on the exam at a time, meaning you can't go back and change anything once you've submitted your answer. When you're done with the exam, they give you a printout right there with your total score, as well as a score from the 4 content areas. So you get a total score averaged together, and you have the 4 content areas. The 4 content areas are basic sciences, equipment, instruments and technology, general principles of anesthesiology, and anesthesia for special procedures and special populations. There's a more detailed content outline. If you go to the NBCRNA's website, you can get a very detailed content outline. It tells you all the different sub-content, the major headings, as well as the smaller content areas. So I recommend that you do take a look at that so you understand and make sure you've covered all those content areas. Each of the 4 content areas, the 4 I just described, the major content areas, are worth 25% of the total grade of the C, which is not true for the NCE. The NCE weights them differently. At the C, they're each worth 25%. And your total grade is just an average of the 4 of them, 25% each. You round them up, or you take them together and average them together. So you could do really poorly in one area, but your average could be high enough where you get the score that you're hoping for. Speaking of scores, what score is a good score on the C? Well, it's almost impossible to answer what that is. There is a correlation between how well that people do on the C and how you'll do on the NCE, or the board exam. So in general, a higher the score on the C means that the higher you're more likely to get a higher score on the board exam or the NCE. That seems like an obvious statement, but that wasn't always true. The C wasn't always a good predictor for success on the NCE. But now with the new changes to the C since 2016, it is a much better predictor. If your program requires a certain score, then obviously that's the score you want to get. An average score is about 424. Interestingly, men do slightly better than women on the exam, and younger exam takers do better than older ones. It's also interesting to note that the C score appears to be impacted by the ICU work you worked on prior to CRNA school. So wherever you worked prior to starting CRNA school, it can impact your C score. But that's only true if you take it during your first year. So if you happen to take the C during your first year of CRNA school, if you're from the neuro ICU, you're more likely to get a higher score than someone from the CCU, interestingly. However, by the time your third year comes around, there's no difference in the C scores. The score margins are pretty small too, I will say. The average score of someone who ended up failing the NCE on their first attempt is a 409. Whereas the average C score for someone who passed the NCE the first try is 447. So small windows for a margin for error there. If you average those two together, the 409 and the 407, the 409 for the average of people who fail the first time and the 447 for the average of people who pass the first time, you get about a 430. So that's a common score that a lot of programs actually requires, a 430, they say. If you get a 430, you're probably on a good track to pass the NCE in the first try. So that's the C in a nutshell. Hopefully that takes some of the fear and mystery out of the exam for you. We did a separate video on the NCE, so be sure to check that out. And be sure to look through our other content on study strategies for the C, the NCE, and succeeding in CRNA school. If you want more content like this, please subscribe. Remember, Olivate exists for one reason: to help you succeed in CRNA school and pass the board exam on your first try.